The Greenland shark is an example of extreme longevity. We never really knew how old they were until researchers from this paper here, which is maybe 6 or 7 years old, went and used radiocarbon dating to look at the crystals inside the lenses of their eyes, which are formed during embryonic development. And then they're not changed again. So the carbon that is deposited in their eyeballs is deposited when they're developing as a baby, and then it never changes again. So you can actually take that carbon, you can look at the ratio of a slow decaying radioactive version of that carbon and a stable version, and you can therefore sort of figure out how old it is. Their age distribution is inferred to be around 400 years plus or minus 120 years. There's some intrinsic uncertainty to the process. But what that would mean is that these sharks were born anywhere from the year 1500 to 1700. But they were most likely born around 1600 AD, meaning that these sharks were born before Columbus was sailing to explore the New World. They have this incredibly slow, what we in evolutionary biology would call life history. They unbelievably reach sexual maturity at the young age of 150 years. It seems insane that
That's hilarious. Dr. William Ratcliffe, welcome back to The Giant Shoulder, and a huge welcome to Dr. Tony Burnetti, first time on the channel. This is super exciting. We are ranking evolutionary adaptations. William Ratcliffe, take us away. Let's go.
All right, it's great to be here. Thanks for having us on, Evan. We're going to start out, I think, with not to tip my hand, the granddaddy of all evolutionary innovations, the substrate that makes it possible, the Darwinian algorithm, which is the almost inevitable way in which life evolves, information accrues in living systems, and in which you can get, essentially unbounded amounts of organization from just chaotic, messy, unorganized substrates. I call it an algorithm because in order for this process of Darwinian evolution to occur, you just need three things to be true. And this isn't only a biology thing. This actually plays out in other areas as well. But let me walk through how this process works before I sort of tell you about how it applies to things outside of biology. First, you need to have what we could call an organism, but really it's an entity that can grow and reproduce copies of itself. The fact that something reproduces means that you get exponential growth out of that. Even if something's only making 2 copies of itself, it doesn't take very long for there to be millions, billions, trillions of that because growth is exponential. You could calculate the time it would take for a single dividing E. coli, if it never slows down by running out of food, to make a colony the size of planet Earth. And it's less than 2 days. So exponential growth is very, very powerful, and you get
Wild.
huge amounts of things. And what that means is that you immediately run out of resources, you run out of room, and competition starts to play out, right? That becomes important because when these things are reproducing, they're not always making copies of themselves that are exactly the same. The second step in the Darwinian algorithm is that these organisms, have to have traits that are at least somewhat heritable. So they have to vary, and that variation has to be sort of passed on to offspring. Now, if that's true, and those traits affect what we would call fitness in biology, but really this just means the frequency of that reproducing entity in a population of them over time, right? There's only 2 ways that you can increase the frequency of something over time. That is by adding more through reproduction or removing them less frequently through death. So all of biology boils down to these 2 things, a birth-death process. All of fitness boils down to how it affects reproduction and survival. And so if these things that are, reproducing and getting variation, which might occur because of a mutation in DNA, but that's not the only way to get heritable variation. If this allows those things that are reproducing to outcompete their fellows, they will begin to increase in frequency, either through having more babies or dying less frequently. And over time, the population gets more fit. You can see this Python simulation of reproducing entities here, in which there's mutations that accrue that increase their rate of reproduction. And you can see how the population is getting more fit over time. These could be redwood trees. They could be dogs. They could be bacteria. They could be symbiotic consortia of bacteria. The point is, it's kind of, it doesn't really matter what the unit is here. As long as they have these 3 properties, they can gain adaptations through this process of natural selection. They can get more fit through time. And this process of Darwinian evolution is, in fact, how complex biological systems arise from initially less complex parts. That doesn't mean that biology always gets more complex, but this is the process through which information gets sort of embedded into biology. Just the final thing I want to say is that this algorithm is like just a fact of the universe. It's like F equals ma. If something fits these criteria, it will evolve. So you see information evolving, right? Ideas spread from brain to brain, more successful versions of that, variants of that, outcompete less successful ones. That's the substrate for cultural evolution. You see, this can apply to just plain chemistry. Before we really called it biology, you could have replicating chemical polymers that if they can figure out a way, if a mutation arises, which makes that replicated chemical polymer persist longer by being essentially having higher survival or reproduce itself faster, it's more fit. It will increase in frequency. And you can even sort of leverage this idea in computer programs to use, Darwinian algorithms to solve problems. So this is this sort of fact of the universe that this sort of, that this process simply works is a passive way that doesn't require any outside agency to come in and structure a system that nonetheless allows for unbounded amounts of complexification, of refinement. And for me, this makes it, I think, at the very top of our tiers list.
So beautifully explained, man. Well done. I love it. So cool. I love that point about it. You really you don't need a full organism. What do you think, or do you have any idea what the very first system to undergo the Darwinian algorithm was? Like, how simple really was it? Like, what was it? A local chemical formula? Like, talk about that. Like, what do you think the first ever system was to undergo Darwinian evolution?
We're actually very fortunate that our co-guest here, Tony Burnetti, has studied the origin of life a lot more than I have. And so I'm actually going to punt over to Tony and see what he thinks about that.
So so there's a lot of people who talk about a lot of different ideas for very early life. And so if you're talking about the um ability, there's if you like Will just said, if you're talking about the ability of the equivalent of digital information in a genome passing down, that is extraordinarily interesting, and that is extraordinarily powerful. And you can get that from just from any sort of templating polymers, like anything where there's a where anything where order matters and the difference in the order makes a difference. You can have that information passing down, and there's some really cool work to the effect that pretty much the oldest sequence in all of biology is probably the middle of the ribosome, the part of your ribosome where you take nucleic acid sequence information and turn it into protein sequence information. That seems to be the oldest inherited sequence in all of biology. I mean, it's necessary for almost any of your inherited sequence to mean anything, so that makes some sense. At the same time, you've got people who talk about uh, origin of life ideas where the early phases don't have things like inherited sequence, where instead you just have a sort of metabolic process snowballing and getting and going harder and harder and faster before you get something like inherited sequence, a thing where just a chemical milieu causes more of that chemical milieu to occur and causes more energy to transduce through it. So you can have this idea of inherited chemical inherited chemical cycles in across time, even without things like sequence information going through. And there's there's even some people doing some fun computational experiments with this. There's a guy at Google, I think his name Agueli Arcas, I believe that's his name. He's got this really interesting computational evolution simulation where he's just bashing random computer programs against each other in a memory space. And before he gets replicators, he gets just arrangements of instructions that cause more
Mm.
instructions to occur. You're not copying instructions, but you get a more and more dynamic memory space, and then eventually a replicator crystallizes out of that. So there's interesting things that can occur even without directly inherited sequence information.
Can I
Very
just
cool.
add one thing, which is origins of life is a really tricky topic. Partially, I mean, almost entirely because it's so old. Like it had the process of chemistry becoming biology occurred essentially before we have rock records that would really preserve what the hell happened. And if we do have rocks from 4 billion years ago, they're scarce, they're transformed like hell, and they're just, and they don't tend to preserve the kinds of very, very fine, molecular biology that we'd really like to know about how this process unfolded. And even with that kind of data, if it existed, it'd be hard to get dynamics, right? You're just getting a snapshot. That being said, it had to have occurred in the sense that you had to have gone from a state of non-living chemistry to chemistry which has co-opted the Darwinian algorithm and slowly accrued essentially additional mechanisms that increase the fitness of those chemical replicators, right? By transducing energy through the environment more effectively, by making more copies of themselves, by effectively increasing reproduction and survival. And we live on a planet that's living because this Darwinian algorithm process works and because chemistry was essentially able to co-opt it without knowing that it's doing it. That's the beauty of it. It all gets done without anything having any idea that it is doing it, right? Simply the things that do it outcompete those that don't.
Yeah.
That's
You
the
get
beauty of it. It's tautological, and
you you get you
that's
get
okay.
canalized. You get the world gets canalized into a state where there's more information passing down the generations because the information that's stable stays.
Yeah.
Can you explain that idea, canalization? What do you mean exactly by that?
So it's that like so you can have all kinds of different states of the world. You could imagine an enormous number of ways the world could be, but it turns out that the states of the world where there's information passing down through time, like through organisms reproducing, are stable because it makes
Right.
the information that's in the present be present in the future. Something where there isn't a replicator is, by comparison, less stable. The world gets canalized into this state where there's information passing down through time.
I have a weird way of giving you an example that Tony told me that might make more sense. So we're going to come back to sharks a little bit later in this, and we should probably move on so we can get to our other innovations. But sharks evolved hundreds of millions of years ago, and are very slow evolving in the sense that their morphology, their shape, their traits, it doesn't change very rapidly. And so uh, Tony said this. I think I'm going to paraphrase Tony. The Earth remembers sharks more clearly than it remembers mountains. That is, plate tectonics occurs at a rate that is far faster than shark evolution. We've had mountain ranges arise and fall in a period of time where sharks have changed very little. And that's because, in a sense, replicators, in which like the dynamic process of evolution here doesn't always have to result in change. This is a great counterexample. You can have something where you basically found peak shark traits, and it's really hard to improve upon that. And you kind of lock in, and the fact that any variance off that can get pruned away, you can become very, very stable. So the Darwinian algorithm is very flexible. It can both result in very rapid change or hundreds of millions of years of essentially information fidelity, where sharks don't change in a way that the Himalayas, rise from nothing,
Yeah,
which is,
Right.
yeah.
yeah, pretty cool.
On a planet
It's
like
very
Earth, a shark is more stable than a mountain.
so cool. I think we need to go to the Greenland shark next because that
Okay.
this is so well set up and transitions well into it.
That
I couldn't believe when I learned that Greenland sharks live to 400 years. Is that right? Is that the average age? Is that the oldest one
it's a.
ever?
I'll show you a little data.
Yeah, please.
2025 is the year that me and you are going to fix our sleep. Now, that does not mean that we need to go full Brian Johnson on it, but one thing we can do that's super easy is to buy the highest quality sleep mask on the market, and that is Manta. I've been blown away by how much better I sleep with one of these on. It's just a fact that people are not sleeping in completely dark environments, and studies show that that affects sleep quality, time to get to sleep, and increases the fragmentation of your sleep. I have tried other sleep masks. I first bought one on Amazon last year for like €5, but the problem is they're just really poor quality. They don't really block out any of the light, and you can't adjust them to your planet-sized head. Manta is fully adjustable, so it literally will fit all of the strangest and weirdest size heads out there, like mine. The Manta mask is literally completely blackout. I have studio lights coming at me from here, and I can't tell the difference. It is absolutely pitch black. This is the perfect environment that you need for sleep. Manta honestly feels like you're being cuddled by a cloud. I actively enjoy and look forward to putting these on each night. I just realized how boring that makes my life sound. I sleep with Manta every single night, and I've seen direct improvements in the quality, duration, and how rested I feel when I wake up. My Whoop data seems to agree. I also bought one for my girlfriend and she also loves it. Manta have a bunch of different sleep masks on their website. I have tried the normal sleep mask as well as the sound mask. I like to listen to audiobooks at night, so for that reason, the sound mask was actually really good. For some reason, my girlfriend doesn't want to listen to how reality is a perception at 11 o'clock when we're trying to sleep, so this was a really good solution for that. It's also incredibly comfortable. But as I said, I think for most people, like 90% of people, the normal ordinary mask is going to fill their requirements. Super comfortable and completely adjustable. Literally is just a really high quality, well-made product. It's the best on the market. Manta are giving my viewers 10% off their first sleep mask. They ship internationally and they also offer a 60-day free trial. That's 59 of the best nights of sleep you've ever had. I literally promise that. But if for any reason you aren't satisfied, you will get your money back, no questions asked. I really couldn't recommend more if you're looking to do something to improve your sleep. A sleep mask is the lowest hanging fruit. It's so simple and easy to apply, and I think it will benefit your life and overall health, and I could not recommend Manta more.
So the Greenland shark is an example of extreme longevity. They are actually a very large shark. They can be more than 20 feet long and 2,500 pounds, maybe 2,200. And we never really knew how old they were until researchers from this paper here, which is maybe 6 or 7 years old, I should have cited it by author and year, went and used radiocarbon dating to look at the crystals inside the lenses of their eyes, which are formed during embryonic development. And then they're not changed again. So the carbon that is deposited in their eyeballs is deposited when they're developing as a baby, and then it never changes again. So you can actually take that carbon, you can look at the ratio of a slow decaying radioactive version of that carbon and a stable version, and you can therefore sort of figure out how old it is. And this plot here is a plot taken from their paper, which shows each of these distributions is the sort of probability distribution of the age of an individual shark. So what they did is they basically sort of fit this curve to it and said, all right, our oldest sharks, right, their age distribution is inferred to be around 400 years plus or minus 120 years. There's some intrinsic uncertainty to the process. But what that would mean is that these sharks were born anywhere from the year 1500 to 1700. But they were most likely born around 1600 AD, meaning that these sharks were born before Columbus was sailing to explore the New World. Individual sharks, they're still swimming around, they're still eating. They have this incredibly slow, what we in evolutionary biology would call life history. They unbelievably reach sexual maturity at the young age of 150 years. It seems insane that
That's hilarious.
an organism would evolve to live to that, but they have this extremely slow growth rate where they're basically in water that's just a degree or two above freezing. Their bodies are filled with effectively antifreeze, which makes them very toxic to eat. So you wouldn't want to eat them unless you were going to do I think it's an Icelandic dish. I could be wrong, which Nordic country it is, where they bury it and ferment it, and it's apparently one of the most infamously terrible smelling foods ever. That makes it palatable, but otherwise it's toxic. They are pregnant for between 8 and 18 years.
My God.
Yeah, so everything is running slow with these guys. Yeah, and so they figured it again. They figured out their age by looking at these crystals in their eyes. And a fun fact of this is that they can't actually use that post 1960 because the radioactive fallout from the nuclear bomb testing basically polluted. It polluted the oceans, and they no longer are able to make the same kind of estimates that they were making before. Just
That's so
kind of cool.
sad. You
Yeah.
can't do the carbon dating in the crystals of the eyes of the Greenland sharks because we polluted the oceans with nuclear waste.
Yeah, so now that I say it, I'm not exactly sure why radioactive bomb testing would result
I
in
can
radiocarbon pollution.
I
Tony, do
can
you know the answer to
yeah,
that?
yeah, it's just when you set off the nuclear bomb, lots of stuff gets irradiated. And you
Mm,
generate radioactive stuff. That's what fallout is. Not
mm,
just the fission products. It's also just whatever was close enough to the explosion absorbs neutrons. And so the carbon 14 content of the atmosphere measurably rose from the
mm,
1940s through the 1970s from all
Right.
mm.
the radioactive carbon that was generated from atmospheric nuclear tests. So things that took up carbon in the last 50 years have way too much carbon 14 and the
Mm.
and do weird things when you try to do radiocarbon dating with them.
Awesome point. Okay, so let's move along here. This is an example of extreme longevity, and really one of the things I'd like to point out is that while this paper found two sharks that were born approximately in the year 1600, they're really undersampling old sharks, right? They only have a couple examples to look at. So if I was to apply like a sort of, first principles statistical guess here, I would say that there are probably much older sharks swimming around, right? That you just didn't sample because they're not very common and they
Right.
didn't sample that many sharks. So it's really a minimum estimate. The minimum age is 400 years. Who knows how long these things actually live? And it's sort of too bad that in the 1960s, up until the 1960s and 70s, we were harvesting huge numbers of these sharks just for their oil content. And also, they were the subject of a sort of anti-fish competition culling effort around then too, because they were thought to compete with fishermen for catch. And so probably a lot of these, who knows how old, 700 years? It seems plausible to me. We have no
Just
reason to
so
think that these
insane.
have a real hard upper age limit. We may have just been, murdering these incredible ancient national living treasures for nothing more than a bit of oil in their bodies.
Yeah, it's so sad. But what a story though. Wait, keep that shark up for a sec. I have so many questions on this. I
All
think
right.
this is absolutely mind-blowingly interesting. How much do we know about why the inner metabolism of the Greenland shark seems to run so slowly? Is this, I would assume this isn't a single gene mutation. It must be multiple that make just the whole system work on a slower time scale. Like what do we know about the genes in the Greenland shark that make it so unique in this regard?
Very little. They're a pretty understudied organism. When you even try and figure out what their litter size is, which you would think fishermen would have incredibly good data on, or even just, I don't know, scientists, cutting open harvested specimens and counting the number of pups, there are estimates that vary by a factor of 10. So, it's like, do they have 10 pups or 200? To me, the fact that there is like, contested data about something so basic really suggests that they're just very understudied. And from a genomics perspective, I'm not an expert in sharks, and I didn't do a deep dive on the genomics of Greenland sharks, so I'm not in the best position to answer that, but I would be shocked if we really understood the mechanisms of extreme age. But this also gets to a broader thing that, we can do sort of, we can generate organisms that vary in longevity considerably even in contemporary times. So there's a scientist named Michael Rose that bred very short and very long-lived fruit flies just by allowing the firstborn or or really old flies to reproduce. And you rapidly diverge from one population to things that have more than a factor of two differences in longevity. But figuring out the causal mechanism of that's much easier said than done. And those things are really recently evolved from a common ancestor. You can do this with dogs, right? I think they may have lost funding, but there was this fantastic consortium. People were sending in samples of these dogs that have very different like longevities, there are dogs that live to 7, dogs that live to 14, right? Breeds. And they're all came from wolves 20,000, 30,000 years ago, not that long ago, right? And so even there, like while you get some genes that are associated with differences in longevity, you can do these genomic wide screens. it's really hard to know like the
Yeah.
causal mechanism of what's going on. And that's partly just because biological systems are very complex. They're very high dimensional. And while we can untangle these things, that often requires the kinds of like genetic testing where you would, you know, go in and edit some gene and then do an experiment and see how does changing one or two things at a time, how is that causally affecting these things? And then when you start to talk about thousands of variation and structural variation, and not just individual mutations in genes, but like broader classes of things, changes in gene families, duplications of gene families, changing them. It changes in chromosome copy number. Like it gets complicated really fast in ways that are pretty hard for people to go in and tease apart one thing at a time, right?
Yes. If we did have perfect knowledge of the Greenland shark, do you think there'll be reason to believe that we could edit other genomes and just increase the longevity of that organism? Is it that simple, or is there just
Um, I
it's
I
harder
think
than that?
that Well, I think it's harder than that, and also I don't know that humans would wanna if the Greenland shark's the model, and I'm not saying that it necessarily is, I don't know that humans would take the trade-off of, "Hey, you could live to 500, but you're not having kids till 150." Like, that's just such a change in fundament and you're only gonna eat once a week, and you're gonna sleep 23 hours a day. Like, these things have a radically different life history from us, and I don't think that's very reasonable that we would, necessarily use the same mechanisms to increase longevity if that were even an option. But that being said, I'll just very briefly say that there are, I think evolutionary biologists generally think that aging is not necessarily a guaranteed foregone. It's not a guarantee of living systems that they will inevitably fall apart due to senescence and age. You have organisms that appear to really not undergo this process of senescence, which we would call aging, but it's more technical and that getting worse over time. A fine wine can age positively. Senescence is stinky, scrumpy wine, right? It's getting worse over time. It doesn't necessarily have to occur. There are organisms that don't appear to have much senescence and they can live thousands of years and they do just fine. And that's generally the case when their fitness as an organism gets higher and higher with age rather than less and less relevant to the population. So if a redwood tree can become fire resistant once it's sufficiently large, right? Then, and it can, essentially dominate the canopy and shed millions and millions of seeds every year, then there's really, there's natural selection that maintains their fitness even in late life. You get into trouble when organisms in a natural environment would tend to die anyway, regardless of aging at some time point. Like a mouse isn't probably going to live more than 2 years, no matter how long what its intrinsic senescence is, because there's coyotes and owls and disease and all these things
Right.
and famine that would just make it not exist. And so what that means is that old organisms become relatively unimportant in terms of their fitness and and evolution doesn't really maintain their integrity in old age. So a quick thought experiment there is like imagine that there was a mutation which made your head fall off when you are 150 years old. That's effectively neutral. You're not going to live to 150 to express it anyway, so it could basically
Right.
just by chance go to high frequency and then just get stuck in the genome. There's nothing keep getting rid of it. If the same mutation were to express itself at age 10, now it becomes very costly because it happened before you could reproduce, right? And natural selection is acting against it extremely strongly because it's so costly, right? And so if there's some risk of death in a natural environment and that's not compensated for by huge benefits to fitness really late in life, you tend to just have aging arise as a side effect of evolution being incapable of maintaining integrity at old ages.
Yes.
So I think that's kind of a hopeful thing though, because that means that there is no in principle reason to say that you couldn't keep repairing tissues effectively indefinitely. And the fact that we sort of like fall apart as we age is more of a side effect of evolution being kind of cruddy when we're old, as opposed to a inherent state of being an organism.
Right. Yeah, what I heard there is that senescence is a solvable problem, maybe in our lifetimes. But so
Yeah.
where do we rank the Greenland shark for solving that problem, for basically figuring out longevity? 500,
All right.
600, 700 years old potentially.
So this is strong competition because I put the Greenland shark at a C.
Okay.
Yeah, it's pretty
For
cool. It's
solving
pretty cool.
aging. It gets a C
Well,
for
yes,
solving aging.
in a
That's
very
right.
particular context, but
Yeah, it's living on ice. It's
It's living on ice.
quite literally. It's
Yes,
living
yeah.
under ice, quite literally. Um, but also that's a bit of a hint that I think we have a lot of really cool things coming up if this is pushed all the way down to a C.
Yes. All right, let's move on so that we can prevent this from being the length of an entire Harry Potter movie marathon.
Exactly.
Let's go to the origins of viruses is my next
All right.
one.
All right. So yeah, I want to talk about the apparently multiple origins of viruses. So uh it's viruses. There's a guy named Eugene Koonin who's done absolutely amazing work on viruses for decades now, who I'm cribbing off of here. Uh, he would argue that viruses are relics of ancient replication mechanisms before there were cells, and also other selfish elements escaping out into the world. So, um, first of all, it seems like viruses are just ancient. People, you can look at different kinds of viruses, look at what kinds of cells are infected by different kinds of viruses, look at the debris that viruses leave behind inside genomes after they infect a cell and something goes wrong and it gets passed down. It looks like even the last universal common ancestor, the cell that everything today is descended from, had a variety of viruses, multiple viruses of multiple different kinds of viruses infecting it. And with some recent research from Eugene Koonin, he would argue that all RNA viruses and retroviruses seem to have a single common ancestor back in the pre-cellular replication soup of very early
Wow.
biology. He would argue that cellular life emerged from the cauldron of things figuring out how to replicate, but that there were different kinds of what are called replicons, bits of sequence that are able to replicate themselves. In particular, it looks like there's 3 separate origins of enzymes that can replicate DNA or RNA, for example. And seems like there's relics of multiple sets of replicating nucleic acids in cellular life. Cellular life is a big consortium coming together into one big monolithic block that replicates down the generations. But there's other things going on inside them, what are called selfish elements, just little pieces of sequence that will replicate within a cell across the generations. Um, and then some of these selfish elements move from cell to cell and not just staying within a genome. And so in particular, um, if you look at some of his research, it looks like all the RNA viruses, all the ones that have RNA as their genetic material, seem to have a common ancestry. They all are replicated by enzymes that are related to each other. They have some common structure to how they do that. They've even done some crazy things, like in the process managing to switch from having their genomes be like what's called positive sense to negative sense, have their genomes be the same thing as their coding RNAs that make their proteins, to having their genomes be the opposite strand that then is the template for making the RNAs that make the proteins. But those all seem to have one common ancestry. But you look at the DNA viruses and it starts getting way more complicated. It turns out that DNA viruses, there's multiple obvious instances when you look at them of something like a bacterial plasmid or a transposon, a little piece of replicating sequence that becomes more common in a genome over time, grabbing some proteins that lets it get out of a cell and wind up in another cell. So there there's this fun argument that in the context of a productive system like a cell, eventually the origin of something like a virus is inevitable. A
Mm.
virus is just a pattern that will replicate in the context of something that's productive. When you have a productive enough system, things that are not productive but use that productive system to make more of themselves will emerge and will use it, because that is an environment that, again, that Darwinian algorithm will latch onto, and things that can replicate themselves in that context will appear. And so you've got some of these which seem to be ancient, back to before the last universal common ancestor, relics of different kinds of replication sticking around, and other times whole new spreading replicators emerging out of the soup of cellular life. So there's multiple ways it can happen, and it keeps
Super
happening.
cool. When you say ancient, do we have a timeline? Do we know roughly when it might have been?
Um, well, as for the last universal common ancestor, I mean, people try to put timing on that, and every time they do a more complicated job, it winds up getting pushed earlier, as near as I can tell. So, like, there's there's recent work where people try to do genetic clocks, where they look at the differences between bacteria and archaea, and the fact that there's photosynthesis in the bacteria, and we see evidence of photosynthesis back certain times in life. There's people who have put the last universal common ancestor back 4 point something billion years in the past. My bias tends to be everything's older than you think, because you don't actually have the oldest evidence for things, you just have the oldest evidence that you've found. But like, there's by the time you had cellular life, you already had a whole panoply of viruses already infecting it, and a whole panoply of selfish elements living inside it and replicating themselves inside it across the generations. And you probably had this even if you didn't have cellular life, even if you had simpler replicating systems, there were probably parasitic replicators replicating within these replicating systems basically as long as they were. It's almost inevitable that you get this. There's a famous experiment in the 1970s from someone called Spiegelman. Um, this is an experiment on a virus, but let's put that aside for a moment. They took the replicative machinery of a virus and just made a lot of it and put it in a tube, and then put a genome of that virus in the tube, just trying to make lots and lots and lots of the virus. They didn't make lots of the virus. They made lots and lots of this little tiny piece of RNA that was just big enough to use the replicative machinery of the virus. And I think you can make an argument that you see as something similar at a bigger scale, that you have the productive machinery of cellular life, and eventually you just get systems within cellular life that use that machinery to replicate themselves rather than being productive. It's
Wow.
it's 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 almost like it's almost inevitable. You have a productive system,
Yes.
patterns that don't produce but can replicate will replicate in that productive system.
So is one of the inferences from that if viruses likely replicate out of cellular like systems, that cells came first? Or did I hear initially that you said that also maybe there were viruses that came before cells?
Um,
What do we think about that?
there's been models of pre-cellular life. They call it almost like the virus world before the cellular world. The idea there was that you had some sort of pre-cellular productive system, like like a pre-cellular metabolism that was making organic material and whatnot. And the idea was that you had multiple small pieces of sequence which would replicate, and were just um, moving around in this less cellular productive system. And if you had some that made the system more productive, they would come together, and you sort of nucleate cells out of that by having lots and lots of useful genomes come together. But there would be other ones that just use the system to replicate, and those would be the ancestors of some of the viruses of the world. Um, a more a less specific model, one that makes less very specific claims, would be that before cellular life, you had a lot of replicating systems that were related to each other but different. And cellular life is like one of those sets of systems really getting good and complicated and taking over, and that the remains of other ones are parasitizing them to this day.
Very cool, man. Awesome.
There's a whole bunch of interesting ideas on this, but it's also super clear that viruses are incredibly important to the evolution of life in general. They've always been with us. Dealing with them has always been something that cells have had to do. There was never a time that they didn't have to. And they also just do interesting things to evolution. They're a way to move DNA from one lineage to another in a way that you can't, that's at least a lot harder. Doing regular old replication, you can move information from one chain of living things to another chain of living things. They they evolve incredibly fast, and so they can be a source of novelty in evolution. They can invent new things faster than cellular life can. Like your adaptive immune system is is it's not from a virus, but it's from a selfish element. There's the fact that we can scramble our DNA in order to make new antibodies against anything, that comes from something called a transposon that replicates itself inside cells, making more copies of itself from generation to generation. The vertebrates went and domesticated one of those, and we use it to scramble the antibody gene. In order to generate novelty, in order to allow us to adapt against whatever pathogen we see.
Super
That's a
cool,
kind of
man.
beautiful version of co-opting the very mechanism we're trying to fight.
Do we put the origin of viruses in our biological adaptations tier list? Do we have
Oh,
any agreement between the experts here? Where are we
um,
placing it?
I I think we should also give this one a C because it's incredibly interesting and incredibly old, but it also is something that every living thing has had to deal with for a long time and can cause all kinds of bad things. I'd certainly prefer not to get infected.
No, it's a good I think it's a very underestimated point just how much impact viruses have had on the entire domain of life, right?
Yeah.
The different information transfer mechanisms that you talked about there. I think it's a really interesting point just about how much of life is only possible because of viruses and what
Yeah.
the very specific functions that they serve.
Mhm.
Super interesting. Really well said. Okay. Let's Camouflage is next. I loved this example. I still remember learning about Batesian mimicry in my evolution
Hmm.
lecture in college and just loved it. It was one of the first purely beautiful examples of like, wow, that's actually possible. And
Hmm.
then you keep learning and you're like, oh wow, that was nothing. But at the time it blew you away, and it still is. There's a simplistic beauty to it.
Yeah. So, yeah, camouflage, I mean, just sometimes selection favors not getting noticed by other organisms. And so, beautiful example right here. Look on the left there. That is a moth. That is a moth pretending to be a stick. And in particular, that is what a stick looks like to a bird. It doesn't matter what another moth thinks. It doesn't matter what you and I think. It matters what the thing that is trying to eat that moth thinks.
Right.
And that being said, look at that. That is an amazing sculpture of a stick shaped by evolution. And this is shaped by the fact that the more that moth looks like a stick, the less likely it is to be eaten. And so this organism comes to resemble some aspect of its environment. Um, and this mimicry is all over the place. It's super interesting. But again, it really matters what organism you're trying to hide from. Tigers, you look at a tiger, you might not think that that's very good camouflage out in the jungle. But mammals have bad eyes. Primates have much better eyes than most mammals. Most mammals are colorblind. And it turns out that to your generic mammal, tiger's perfectly camouflaged. It's got it's the freaking green leaf shadows of the jungle hiding. So there's these these things melt into the back. The way I think about camouflage, I think of it as an organism slamming into its environment over and over again until it fits. It changes until it fits that environment over time.
Can we
Tony,
maybe sorry, go
oh,
Will, please.
I was going to say, Tony also once told me, I don't know if you came up with this, but I really like it, sticks in my brain, Tony,
Mhm.
that camouflage is an example of nature painting one organism through the eyes of another. Like this stick bug or this moth, it doesn't know that it looks like a stick. It does not want to look like a stick. The fact that it looks like a stick is not something that it could possibly comprehend. That's not the it's like it's not dressing up the way that we would if we were trying to fit into our environment with face paint and stuff. We're trying to look like a stick. It's just that those that look like sticks are eaten less frequently than those that don't. And over many generations, you get the visual pattern matching of a bird shaping the morphology of another thing, which is this bizarre way in
Yeah,
which these co-evolving systems like
yeah,
dynamically paint one another in a
yeah,
way
Yeah.
that we can look at and go, "Oh, holy crap, that's so
yeah.
cool."
You're extracting what a stick looks like to a bird and painting it on the wings of a moth
Yeah.
over time.
Yeah, but purely through incidental, accidental mutations, right? So
Yeah. Yep.
every mutation that made it look 1% more like the stick was just favored over time, and it was eaten 1% less because it looked 1% more like the stick, and then every mutation was probably percentage points more stick-like until you just have this stable strategy where they're all very stick-like then.
Hmm. Yep.
Yeah, I mean it's a little less deterministic in reality. It's noisier, but yeah, that's the basic idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So cool, so cool.
Yeah.
Any other cool examples of camouflage in the animal kingdom that come to mind? What is the is it there's some animal that has like a rattlesnake hanging out the back of it, or like what I'm not sure if
There
is it a mammal that has a rattlesnake, or a rattlesnake that has a mammal? What is it?
there
I'm
is a
I'm
snake.
Go ahead.
Well, there's a snake that that has a spider-like tail appendage, and it
Maybe that's it.
slowly moves it. So the snake is like very cryptic. Like, it blends into the rocks. You don't see it, but it moves its tail back and forth in a way that makes it look like a spider is running back and forth. A bird jumps down, tries to bite it, and then the snake bites the bird.
That's
I'm
so
I'm a
crazy.
I'm a fan of the squid that can change their color and thus can
Mm,
camouflage against almost anything.
mm, totally.
Yes. We need to give a shout out to the giant cuttlefish here. I think
Mm.
Yeah.
me and Will were talking about Peter Godfrey Smith's work on cuttlefish. They have the most amazing camouflage systems that I've ever seen, and somehow it seems to relate to their own emotion and their own physiology in a
Mm-hmm.
weird way that I don't know if we fully understand. Peter, the way Peter explained it to me was that
Hmm.
some part of it seems to be the organism itself understanding its own physiological state, but then also communicating it to other giant cuttlefish. But I'll put videos up online of that. Just another stunning
So cool.
example of camouflage.
Mm-hmm.
This is like the color waves and sort of. Is that the one or?
Yeah, yeah.
Mm, mm, mm.
The the chromatophores, I believe, that just
Yeah.
do these
Yeah.
beautiful,
Yeah.
depending on where it's passing, what color the coral is that's behind it, just completely seeps into it. So cool,
So
cool.
cool.
Where does
When your
camouflage go?
skin is a biological RGB screen.
Right. Possibly the nerdiest sentence I've ever heard in my life.
Yeah. And each cell is a pixel.
Mhm.
Where do we put this one? I think, well, Tony, it's yours. What do you think?
I think this goes with an A because
Hell yeah.
it's just a perfect example of how evolution over time makes an organism fit its environment in a very visible and very literal way.
I agree. I think it's beautiful. It's one that's accessible to everyone, so everyone can understand it fully. Like, I'm not sure everyone's gonna fully understand the amazingness of the virus one before this. The
Mm-hmm.
camouflage is accessible to everyone. They can see that is just stunningly cool example in nature. I agree. I'm
Yeah.
happy with A. All right. Although camouflage in A and Greenland shark solving aging in C, there's some contention there, but that's okay. Let's move on because we
It's
don't have much
pretty
time.
arbitrary, isn't it?
Yes, a bit. Bombardier beetle.
The Bombardier beetle, I don't know how you say it. That sounds good. Bombardier is a beetle. There's in fact hundreds of species of this that has evolved chemical warfare, or at least chemical defense. It has these two organs, one of which basically generates hydroquinones, and a second which makes hydrogen peroxide. Hydrogen quinones are basically an organic molecule that's highly reducing. When it is mixed with hydrogen peroxide, you can see it how it has these two sort of organs which go down to a central funnel at the very bottom. When it excretes those and they mix, there's also some enzymes that act as catalysts. The hydrogen peroxide is very oxidizing, the hydroquinones are very reducing. And what that means is that you have something which is an extremely exothermic reaction. It releases a huge amount of heat, and this mixture goes effectively to boiling instantaneously and explodes out the back of this beetle with an audible pop. So if you went up to this beetle and you're a predator, right? We talked about birds that make camouflage, right? This is another way to not get eaten, right? You can avoid being eaten because they don't see you. Or if a bird comes down and tries to bite you, or maybe a spider comes up and tries to grab you, they have this nozzle that can be pointed in virtually any direction, and they just let loose this boiling hot caustic reaction into the face of the attacker, which I think of as, oh, I'm hungry, right? Oh, there's a pot on my stove. I'm gonna go over there. I'm gonna open it up. I'm gonna see what's in that pot, right? But you don't know that that pot is actually a pressure cooker. And when you open the top, it explodes in your face, burning you. But not only that, it's filled with acid. That's kind of what these beetles do. Um, it's an incredible adaptation, right? We have these somewhat complicated system of a two-part chemical mixture that when mixed together reacts. So I think it's a fantastic adaptation.
Beautiful.
Um,
Do
yeah,
these do the hydroquinones and hydrogen peroxide do anything else? Like, are they in the chamber for a different purpose, and then when they need to, they can be shaked together and Molotov cocktailed at the enemy? Or like, do
I
they
don't
have a
think so. I'm not an expert in this, to be honest, but I think I think this is purely a weapon. Like they've nothing else has a chamber filled with hydrogen peroxide that I'm aware of, right? Like that's a very specific organ. And and there's a whole mixing center with specific enzymes to react them really fast. So it appears to be, purpose evolved for blasting your attacker in the face.
What's surprising about that is that these are stepwise mutations, right? So like one mutation you often hear about
Yeah.
to get from, you know, not an to just say one light sensitive receptor to an eyeball,
Mhm.
every stage in the middle has to be stable in of itself, right?
Mhm.
So I'm
Mhm.
curious about this one is like, how do you have like two like chemicals here that are required to react together in an exothermic way to act as a defense system, but does
Mhm.
hydrogen peroxide have to have utility on itself for it to evolve that chamber and then the next chamber? Like, paint the picture of how
Yeah.
these wild sort of systems like evolve in a stepwise way where they're all individually stable.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. Often things that appear to be super finely tuned and you remove one part and it has no function can be hard to explain the origin of, where every step has to, create has to have some benefit, or at least not be too costly. There are ways that you can kind of valley cross, to use a metaphor, where you could get a series of things that are not very good to get to something else that's really good. And so not everything is always has to be immediately adaptive. You
Right.
can release that constraint. But I don't know the answer for this specific organism. It's not a system that I study, and I haven't done like a deep research read on what we know about the evolutionary history of chemical warfare here. Um, but generally speaking, what you often see are things that have some intermediate where there's a different purpose originally, and it gets co-opted and refined for a new function. So lots of insects make bad odors, right? You mess with a stink bug and it squirts some stinky juice on your finger, and that's unappetizing, but it's not going to hurt you, right? And so, you could see something like that where you have an insect that's already primed to make some foul smelling, mixture upon agitation. Peroxide is just a way to make, chemical reactions occur more rapidly here. Initially, it's not really that hot, but hey, you make a little more peroxide, and it's warm, and that it's more stinky. I'm purely speculating. This is not informed speculation
Yeah.
whatsoever. But you could see how something which starts out with just like I'm going to excrete grossness on you when you touch me can gradually evolve to, okay, well, let's actually make a little, subsection here, which, like, yeah, and insects are filled with little crypt like organelles, like organs. That's not a hard thing for insects to have. Like, There's insects that have symbiotic crypts, and insects that have like digestive crypts, and insects that have crypts of all kinds. Crypt being just like a membrane that protrudes off and does something, like that's really easy, I think, in evolution to just take a, a part of a membrane, just make a new kind of tunnel, right? So again, you could imagine something which starts out as just like, all right, we're going to sequester more stuff here. Maybe we're going to start to separate what types of chemicals we have in different parts, and you just elaborate from there to the point where now you're able to generate the volume and able to tolerate producing this and doesn't hurt you, because that's the other thing that's amazing. It's 200, it's 212 degrees Fahrenheit. It's 100 degrees C. It's
Yeah.
caustic. That for almost any organism would damage itself, but they've created an organ which is robust. It's fantastic.
Very cool. Such a
Yeah.
such a crazy cool example. I absolutely love it.
Yeah.
Where where is it on the list, do we reckon?
All right. Let's put that as a B. I think that's cool as hell, but not quite camouflaged here.
Okay. Very, very cool. I agree.
Something that always strikes me when I talk to neuroscientists is just how staggeringly complex the brain really is. It's this incredible prediction engine, always trying to make sense of the world and keep us safe. But it's important to remember we're still running ape hardware. Our brains weren't even remotely built for the chaos of modern life, and sometimes they just get scrambled. I've recently had some difficulty in my own personal life, and I realized that it was about time my own ape prediction system got the gym workout and just rebalancing that it's probably needed for quite a long time. So I booked my first therapy session with BetterHelp, who I'm incredibly excited to be partnering with on this video. A massive umbrella review of hundreds of randomized control trials found that nearly every meta-analysis of psychotherapy favored it over control conditions. In other words, mental health professionals from decades of research consistently find that talking therapies do actually work. BetterHelp is an entirely online therapy platform designed to make that process incredibly simple. You can connect with a licensed therapist from your home on your schedule through video, audio, or even text with literally no fuss at all. What I like about it is that you can switch therapists at any time until you find someone who you personally can build rapport with and open up to, which is such a critical part of therapy, at no extra cost. If you've ever thought about trying therapy, or you're just feeling a little bit stuck in your own head lately like I was, this might be a great first step that I really couldn't recommend more. Visit betterhelp.com/giantshoulder to get 10% off your first month. That's betterhelp/giantshoulder, and in doing so you also support the channel. Links are down below, because sometimes the most powerful way to understand your own brain is just to talk about it.
Mirror life. Let's
Here
first
we
off
go.
start explaining what the hell mirror life is.
All
What does
right.
that mean?
So,
Will scared the bejesus out of me when we talked about this in our first podcast, by the way. I'd heard of it, but really didn't know how dangerous it possibly could be.
okay. So this is something that's for once synthetic rather than natural going on here. Because synthetic biology, sometimes you can do what evolution can't. Because, again, like we said, every step in evolution at least has to work. It doesn't necessarily have to be that every step is an improvement. Every step does have to work. Um, so living things are what's called chiral. When you have organic molecules, carbon can have 4 different bonds coming off of it, often 3-dimensional space, and those have an arrangement. Like there can be mirror images of molecules that have the same composition but are opposite each other, like a left hand and a right hand is the stereotypical thing. I cannot put my left hand on my right hand and have them line up. No matter what I do, something is pointing in a different direction. And the same thing is true of organic molecules. Like the usual examples people talk about are sugars and amino acids, because those are very chiral and very common. So we got what are called left-handed amino acids and right-handed sugars, and that's just a 1800s convention about which direction they rotate polarized light. But again, it's a lot like handedness. So, but it turns out, so like if you cannot make a protein out of a mixture left-handed and right-handed amino acids. All the fancy folds that do all the fancy jobs of a protein involve bonds lining up and you getting this nice geometry of things that fold together. But we've got all left-handed amino acids. All right-handed amino acids would be perfectly good. And there's reason to think that it could have just been random that life settled on using all left rather than all right. You can't really do both, but you got to pick one, and it could have just been random. So what happens if you synthesize artificially some biomolecules that are the mirror image? And a little bit of this has been done. There's been a cool set of experiments where somebody used protein synthesis. They couldn't synthesize an entire protein. They made it in pieces, but they made the DNA polymerase that can replicate mirror DNA. And then they managed to order the chemicals to get mirror image nucleotides and everything, and they could do mirror image PCR and replicate reverse DNA. And they did an experiment. They put this reverse DNA in just pond water for a month, and it did not degrade. And that's because there's no enzymes out in the world for degrading mirror DNA because it's just never been around from the beginning of life on Earth. And so now,
Weird.
yeah. So now imagine instead of one little couple hundred amino acid enzyme, imagine you get an entire replicating system, an entire microbe. It has to be a special microbe because most organisms don't really work outside of an ecosystem. You need something that can do everything. But if you had an organism that could do everything, um, it its biomass would not rot effectively because there's not at least not nearly as quickly as other things do because enzymes would not exist to rapidly break it down. So just material would pile up in its biomass and stay there a lot longer than it would from other things. And here's the really interesting thing: it would be immune to viruses. All the viruses floating around the biosphere that need to be compatible with the replicative machinery of an organism, there is nothing there for them. It is inaccessible. And so you have a whole parallel genetic system, incompatible metabolism. If this is something that, if you do something like this that can replicate out in the world, that could be a problem. And there was a position paper recently from various people saying, yeah, don't do this for any actual replicative systems. It's certainly interesting from a individual enzymes perspective, but maybe don't go poking at this in an interesting way. And so the fun thing though is if you want to talk about what it would mean for that organism is becomes completely invulnerable to viruses, but it also gets cut off from all the genetic information of the rest of the world. Like you look at a bacteria in the world today, every once in a while they take up genes from their environment, and you look back across history, that happens really frequently. Well, from our perspective, it might not be frequent, but from an evolutionary perspective, it's incredibly frequent. It's very important for bacteria evolution. You make a bacteria here, it would be invulnerable to the viruses, but would also be cut off from some of the material for long-term evolution. So it's a weird, interesting circumstance, and one that probably shouldn't be poked at in anything but theory.
Right. So, what are the potential applications of this kind of chemistry of creating these chiral enantiomers? Is there a clear use case since they don't biodegrade? Are we plan on building bridges with these? Like what? Like what? What's the idea? What are they used
Um,
for? And if they can, you know, if they pose such huge risks, they got to have some pretty big application.
Yeah. So one of the ideas, again, the experiment that I talked about with just making mirror DNA and putting it in pond water, it was having very stable molecular scale information. It was just it was a molecule that you could just lay out, and aside from if you bleached it or something, it would more or less stay there. And so stable molecular information is one idea. And
why would that be? Why would that, maybe just elaborate on that a little bit? Why do people want stable molecular information?
I mean, people are always looking for the next way to store the next way to store things, and
Okay.
if you can have molecular scale information to store things, I suppose it's better to have one that doesn't rot than one that does. But
Okay. So
and
maybe
then
even computer applications, like you're saying, you could potentially.
people like I've heard people um give ideas about, like, if you wanted to have uh something that you could store for a really long time, and then if you lost the documentation, you take a swab of it and sequence it, and you get back the information about how to use it or something like that. And but the other fun thing is that, like, again, this is one of the mechanisms that arguably you probably shouldn't poke at, is that let's say you're running a bioreactor, you got a microbe that's making a lot of a drug or something, and so you've got a big tank full of that thing. If a virus gets in that tank and kills off your whole culture, you've lost a culture. Let's say now instead you have one that's literally invulnerable to viruses. That's just better for making things. So, but if you got something that can live out in the world, that might not be a good idea.
Let's put it this way. There are no good use cases. There's nothing really like, if you
Yeah.
had it, it wouldn't change the world in any significant way right now. It's mostly, can we do this? And that's kind of cool, but we shouldn't do it, because if we did, we would unleash something in evolutionary history. Like, you
That
could
hasn't
potentially create
existed.
a mirror life ecosystem, which that cannot happen with normal evolutionary biology, because you'd have, you have to change everything all at once, or the organism is just a puddle of biomolecules. Nothing makes sense at all, right? It'd be like changing half of the words in the English dictionary to Chinese, and then just talking to someone, interspersing 50% of them. If they don't speak Chinese, it doesn't make any sense anymore. It's like
Doesn't make
you've
any sense to
broken
either
the
side of
to
things.
either, right? You've broken the syntactic meaning.
So
So
I'm gonna.
yeah,
Does that mean it's a D?
it's
Yeah.
a D. Hell yeah.
Let's do parasitoid gene therapy.
All right. All right. So this is something that when I heard about it, I was thrilled. So parasitoid wasps, these are wasps that lay their eggs through their stinger syringe inside other insects, usually caterpillars. And turns out 100 million years ago, a DNA virus infected parasitoid wasps and was growing in their ovaries, and they wound up injecting and so it turns out it got incorporated into their genome. This happens sometimes to viruses that infect an organism. It can get stuck in their genome, and this virus got incorporated into the wasp genome and turned by the wasp into a gene delivery system. They make lots and lots of little viral particles, and these viral particles, they're not replicating viruses, they're a gene therapy vector. They inject these particles along with their eggs into a caterpillar, and these particles infect the host's immune system cells and change their behavior so they don't reject and kill the eggs that they have injected. And you can tell these used to be a virus. They're not a virus anymore. They are a gene therapy vector. The genes necessary to make
Wow.
the particles are not put into the caterpillar. They're kept inside the wasp. So it's
That
natural gene therapy.
That's completely insane. And how do we know that this happened 100 million years ago? We've been able to map the molecular genetics all the way back and
Yeah, you can see the subset of parasitoid wasps that all have this common set of viruses in their genome, and that have the common shredding of the genome of the virus into the parts that make the virus and the parts that go along with it. And you can with things that recent, clocks are pretty reliable, and you can figure out when it occurred. And so these things happen. Viruses will infect something, they get stuck in the genome, and then they get used for other purposes.
so bizarre. Do you think there's a lot of examples of this in the animal kingdom, that viruses have fundamentally changed an organism and an organism's functioning, and we just don't know that that was a virus co-opting that organism? Like, do you think there's a
Um,
lot of examples of
we're
this?
finding more of them. I mean, heck, the mammalian placenta is virally derived. We
Wow.
use there's a part of when placentas form where cells fuse, and the fusion is from a viral gene that was used in the past to fuse viral particles onto cells. And there's even a viral gene that's really important in synapses that nobody really understands. That if you get rid of it, the mice can't remember things. So
Wow.
yeah,
That's insane. I've never heard of that. That's really, really
I
interesting.
think that one's called ARC. But yeah, yeah.
So all over, we're saying all over the animal kingdom, there's these examples of viruses co-opting organisms and like fundamentally changing how they function.
I'd
In
call
it
it
with
more
the
organisms co-opting viruses. It's like
okay,
it's like the viruses were infecting the organism, and the organism turns the tables and eats them, and they become part of it.
so wild. Where does it
I
go in
hope you're
material?
enjoying the virus portion of tonight's menu.
They're free. I think they're massively underappreciated again for
Yeah.
just the impact they've had on life and biology. Where do parasitoid gene therapies go on our tier list? That was pretty crazy.
Um, I think that counts as an A. I mean,
Hell yeah.
naturally occurring gene therapy from turning the tables on a virus. I think that counts as an
It's
And
awesome.
do you think it's more crazy than camouflage or less crazy than camouflage?
A. Mm, oh man, I think there's probably, you might count things as crazy as that as rarer than camouflage, but in terms of just what it is, it's I think it's crazy that camouflage happens so much, but
Yes.
the specifics of what happens here are more crazy.
We'll put it ahead.
Yeah.
Next one is language. Let's do language.
Okay, sweet.
So
So,
completely different. We're just diving
yeah,
between
yeah,
such
that's
different
fun.
things. I love it.
All right, so I don't think I'm going to share screen on this one. I'll just talk. Uh,
Like,
Perfect.
I was kind of expecting we would do the genetic code first, to be perfectly honest, but that's totally fine. We'll do the genetic code later. So, language is incredible in that it is, I think, a necessary prerequisite for having complex societies of the kind that we have now. It sounds kind of obvious, but for a very important reason, right? That in the absence of language to transmit information between entities, you basically generally have to evolve like a specific signal to have some specific meaning. So when a dog sees another dog that's a threat, it barks at it, and that's got like one signal has one meaning, right? What language does is it does the same thing as a genetic code in that it allows for combinatoric information storage in a series of what are otherwise arbitrary sounds or written symbols. And so you can store huge amounts of information, you can transmit huge amounts of information, and critically, and I think this is like the thing which allows us to live the standard living that we have around us, right? Is that it allows cultural evolution to become unleashed in that language allows ideas to spread from brain to brain, where good ideas, you can think of these as mutations, tweaks to a good idea, right? I made a wheelbarrow. Oh, wait, if I put some walls on that wheelbarrow, it can hold more. That's great. Everyone's going to start using this version of a wheelbarrow, right? Hey, what if I made the wheel pneumatic rather than a big log, piece of wood? Wow, that's even better. I can go over obstacles more efficiently, right? You can see how you get you create the opportunity for ideas themselves to evolve, to spread from person to person, to be refined, for the better ones to spread, for the worse ones to die off. You have the Darwinian algorithm now playing out in the space of ideas, not in the space of genes. Language is critical because it facilitates the creation of combinatorically encoded ideas that can then be passed from person to person with replicator like dynamics, with heredity, with variation, with selection. And as a result, we live in a society where we are the beneficiaries of billions of lifetimes of ideas. We have distilled the very best ideas for tens of billions of human lifetimes. And we get to benefit from that. And we don't have to know all of that. This is stuff that is propagated at sort of societal level. No one person knows very much. And yet we benefit from it because, we have shirts that cost, one fifth of 1 hour of my labor doing a podcast, and I can buy myself a new shirt and a water bottle, right? If I wanted to make those two things, it would take me a couple days, if not longer. And so language enables the Darwinian algorithm to play out in a new substrate, no longer sort of a genetics biology substrate, but an information cultural evolution in ideas space substrate. And that's what makes humans unique amongst all living things.
These are memes, right?
Memes. So Dawkins, the evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins, coined the term meme as the cultural evolution analog of a gene. Yeah, and then much later, in a very mimetic fashion, it's a great example of this. Memes became, took on a life of their own as like funny things that spread from person to person, which itself is a sort of cultural evolutionary example. But originally, they were meant much more, I think scientifically.
Really well explained. I love it.
Thanks.
Where does language go? I mean, insanely important.
S
It's
tier.
allowed
S
for
tier.
S tier.
Gotta be.
I love it. One more element I love about language, again, I'm going back to Peter Godfrey Smith, is we talked about how language likely is why we have such a rich conscious experience, why we seem to be so much more conscious than other animals. I mean, this is of course a guess, but it seems true that humans have more consciousness than other animals. It's almost certainly true. And it's because of the types of information structures that we can encode within it. And then we have inner speech, so we're constantly thinking about these different really complex informational structures, and then those things have to have subjective value to us. And then that's, one of the ideas of why we have such a rich conscious experience, why we have such a, richness to our subjective lives. Language is such a big component of that, at least people think.
That sounds plausible to me. I like that.
Ant male cloning.
Here we go. This is a
I love this one.
This is so fun, guys. You're so knowledgeable. It's insane.
all right. So this is a paper that just came out a few months ago, and the second I saw it, I was showing it to everyone. So it turns out there's a European ant species that actually produces two very different looking kinds of males within their colonies. And so it turns out they're related to a whole bunch of other species that do something called sperm parasitism, where the queens, when a ant colony gets founded, the queen goes out and mates with a bunch of males, and they actually did this thing where they would mate with a related species, not quite the same species, and in addition to the same species. And so you'd get offspring that were hybrids as well as offspring that were just the one species. But they set it up so that all of the hybrid offspring become workers, whereas the offspring from the same species can become queens. And so they call this sperm parasitism because it's like it makes sure that like all of your all of the organisms that are fully your species are reproductive, whereas the ones that are hybrids, it's like you're stealing the reproductive capacity of another species to make your workers. You don't need to use your own reproductive capacity to make workers. You're using another species that way. But then this species, it turns out, they spread around Europe where this species they like to parasitize doesn't exist. And they're still making the hybrid workers in places where the other species doesn't exist. And you dig up the colonies, there are males of the other species being born to the queens of the completely different species. The same species is giving rise to two different species of male. And so what they've done is they've set it up so that sometimes when a male of this other parasitized species mates with the female just produces a clone of that male. They kick out their own genome from the egg entirely and just clone that male. So they've got this whole clonal lineage of genetically identical males that they use as the fathers of their that they use as the parasitized fathers of their workers. And so is this genetic slavery, or is this like or do you think about it more lightly as, oh, it's like when we make hybrid seeds, like we've got these like hybrid tomatoes that grow so much better, they've got the lineage that they hybridize to make better workers. So it's nuts.
Are we sure that ants don't have like really advanced science, and they're all when we're not looking at them, they have their labs down there, they have their cloning factories, they have really advanced scientific methods, but then when we look at them, they stop doing that and they start
They've got
acting like
cloning
ants
factories
again.
that are much smaller than our cloning factories, that's for
Right.
sure.
That's true. Oh, their biotech is off the hook.
Yeah.
So how the hell does it, basically the question that I ask myself whenever you give these examples is like, how the hell does this evolve? Why does it evolve? Why is it stable to evolve? It seems so much more elaborate and sophisticated than it would need to be for ants to survive. So like, I know we can't really know why, but like, talk about a system like this. Like, why did it
I
evolve?
mean, a lot of things happen because they can. And so in this case, the whole sperm parasitism thing is basically, again, like I said, sperm parasitism happens when the queen goes out and they can mate with their own species and a closely related species, and they can just they've got a cast of unreproductive offspring they need to make. If they can have more of their DNA go into the reproductive offspring and less of their DNA go into the non-reproductive offspring, that's favored, so they can
Let,
parasitize this other species.
let me point out one other thing, which is that often genetic diversity in your offspring, or especially at the level of making a hybrid, can be really beneficial, right? So almost all food crops are utilize this fact of hybrid vigor, right? Like if you cross two related tomato strains, each parent is maybe making, 30 pounds of tomatoes, the hybrid offspring might make 60 or 70, right? There's just this like benefit to having a huge amount of within organism genetic diversity. That's not always true, but in organisms where it is true, you can get huge scale ups in terms of growth rate, vigor, disease resistance, right? And so here it seems to be true for ants that if they were just to mate with their own species and make offspring, they would, that's how most ants do it. So I would say that to answer your first question, this seems so complex for ants to have to invent. These guys are the weird ones. Almost all
Yeah,
ants just do normal. They just mate with their own species, right?
yeah,
But here's an opportunity to sort of systematically co-opt the benefits of having hybrid vigor in your workers, but not in your reproductives. You don't want those, you don't want the genes of the other species going into your reproductives, only the worker caste. And because ants have this strictly developmentally regulated caste system where workers can never become reproductives, if you can figure out how to basically do that genetically, which they've done, then you can basically say, right, the workers are females, they have one copy of a sperm, one copy of an egg's DNA, but we're going to make that sperm come from a different species. But when I make, when I make males to go reproduce, right, those males will only be my genome, not the other species genome,
yeah.
because males and ants only have one copy of the genome. They're weird.
And then what's happened here, though, is you've got this really interesting hybrid vigor, and also as a side benefit, parasitizing your neighbors for some of your reproductive capacity thing going on. But that means that if you're going to do this, you have to be next door to this other species. It has to be
Right.
nearby to be parasitized like this. This species managed to spread by being able to, instead of reaching out for the males, cloning the males,
That's right.
right? And they're able to do that again because ants have some weird genetics where it turns out the males only have one copy of every chromosome, whereas the females have two. So if the mother kicks out her entire genome from the egg and the egg only has the father's genome, it's a perfectly valid male, and you can just clone the male.
So it's definitely genetic slavery. I've been thinking about it, right? It's definitely 100% slavery. Are ants the only example where they produce non-reproducing offspring? Do we see that anywhere else in life?
Oh, it's
Mole
all
rats.
over.
Yeah,
Mole rats, termites. There
mole
are
rats produce non-reproducing offspring.
They're
Mhm.
prevented from developing reproductive systems by essentially the social hierarchy of a dominant female who, like, badgers them into, like, basically they've evolved a caste system where there's a reproducing queen and a bunch of potentially reproductive offspring, but they don't develop the capacity for reproduction until they either go to a new colony where they are the queen or where the queen dies. And then one of them becomes the dominant one. But you
Wild.
see this, like, you see this
Yeah.
across the ants, bees, and wasps. You see it within termites, which are basically related to cockroaches and praying mantises. They've evolved, soldier castes that are non-reproductive, etc. You see this within aphids. There are these forming aphids that form a colony, like not like the little aphids that live on your broccoli or whatever. These ones form a colony in a ball, and basically they have soldier aphids that can't reproduce, can't even feed themselves, have to be fed. So you see it in thrips. You see it in snapping shrimp. Uh, there's a lot of examples of this.
I can't tell what's worse in being a genetic slave or having to wait 150 years to have sex if you're a Greenland shark. Not reaching sexual maturity for
I
150
don't know.
years.
Have you seen those Greenland shark males? They're not so attractive. I'm just kidding.
So bizarre, guys. So bizarre. Okay, where do we put it?
Um, I'm gonna call this one. I'm gonna call this one a B because it's pretty freaking weird, pretty freaking amazing, but uh, not as ubiquitous as things like camouflage, and not quite as crazy as turning a virus into gene therapy.
Any disagreements, Will? What do you think? Less
Nah, I
crazy
mean, the problem
than your
is
beetle?
it's super easy to be bimodal and have things like at the top and the very bottom. So we got to fill the middle ranks. That seems plausible to me.
It seems like an Orwell movie, like a George Orwell, these ants where you're producing these non-reproducing caste
Ugh.
in like a factory. It feels like an Orwell novel to me, dystopian 1984 type situation.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, answer. To be an ant means to not have any concept of self. And as humans, we find that extremely discomforting.
Yeah, an interesting point.
I'll let them do that. I'll let them
Yeah.
handle that end of the
But
biosphere.
at the same time, you can ask one of your skin cells how it feels giving up its life to become a skin cell. It's an analogous problem.
Yeah, yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
Okay. You said genetic code last time. Let's do genetic code because I feel like that should
Yeah.
maybe have been covered a little bit earlier on, but that's okay.
That's all
Okay.
right. Yeah.
So the genetic code is really just how you turn genetic information, your ATGC, into protein information, your 20 different amino acids. And you change this. If you change this, everything breaks. This is the compiler at the middle of the information system of biology. If you change what UCA means, then you're going to change multiple things in every protein, and everything breaks. So this is the basis for the fact that you can have complicated heritable protein information in biology. Um, but you look at the genetic code. The genetic code is optimized. The genetic code is not a random code. Like in the 50s, people wondered if the genetic code was what they called a frozen accident. Like you needed some kind of a code, and once there was a code, it was stuck. But no, our genetic code is incredibly resilient against mutation. That's one of its biggest obvious optimizations. If you compare it against all possible codes in terms of how resilient it is to mutation, it's literally 1 in a million. And there's other things like there's other way, there's structure in it. Like some aspects of the code mean things in terms of like how much carbon or how much nitrogen is in each amino acid. So the code means something, and it's optimal. How do you evolve something that can't change? And it turns out there's ideas about this that possibly tell you something important about what very early life was like. Because in order to do this, in order for the code to evolve, there needs to be different codes that are competing with each other. So this tells you there was a time when there was more than one code. And people have done some fun simulations where they think it also means that you had multiple codes and there were genes moving back and short genes moving back and forth between being read by different codes. And that
Ah,
if you had two codes that were very similar to each other, they could swap genes and they would still kind of mean something. And all the genes would then pile up in the codes that were the most optimal codes. And so the great codes would suck all the information from code space around, and you wind up with everything piling up in the best code. It's
that's so cool.
yeah.
Very, very cool.
This tells you interesting things about what must have been going on in very early life before
And
the last universal common ancestor.
yeah, and to be clear, like this would be pre-cellular. Like this
Yeah.
doesn't really work in a world of cellular life. This works okay in a world where you have things that are kind of spatially structured, like on the surface of some, soil or, the inner basin of a hydrothermal pool or something. But once you have cellular life, right, these things are essentially become extraordinarily like self-internally referential. They're all, genes are really only seeing their own gene products. They're being shared into daughters. And once you have cellular life, we can tell because essentially all cellular life just has the same genetic code, barring a few tiny tweaks. It is the least changing thing in all of biology by far.
Mm.
And the few tiny tweaks that have occurred typically occur within endosymbionts that have the protective natal environment of another cell around it, right? So if you have a mitochondrion or a chloroplast living inside another cell, those were once free living bacteria. They can actually have little tweaks to their genetic code
Yeah.
because
Once their genome gets really small.
their genome gets small, and anything they need can be provided by the host cell anyway. So they're like in an incubator. But outside of that, there's basically almost no changes because it's catastrophic, right? If you were to sort of, if you were to randomly replace one letter in the English alphabet with a Nordic rune, or just a different letter, right? Just to just change the letter, right? Uh, you change the meaning of paragraphs fundamentally, right? And they don't really make sense anymore. And it's even worse biochemically because our brains are good at inferring from crappy context. And so, yeah, and yet the fact that it's highly optimized in multiple dimensions, which I'm thankful that you kind of skipped over, Tony, because it's a bit technical, but nonetheless, it's clear that the genetic code is an exceptionally good code at minimizing the kinds of catastrophic errors that occur from mutation. Like it's like an error buffering code.
Yeah.
Which means that either we got lucky as hell, it's 1 in a million, and we only got one shot at genetic code. We got the 1 in a million, but I don't like to do that. Like statistically, I don't like to assume that if you see something that's 1 in a million, that you just saw it. It only happened once and we're lucky. It's more likely that it evolved. Which points, as Tony said, to this earlier epoch in evolution when the rules were different. Because you basically you don't have clear cellular life with clear vertical transmission where cells just create offspring. You have this hazy, biochemically coupled networks. And it's just a really different way of thinking about evolutionary
and then
biology.
everything piles up in good places. All the genes get sucked
Super
into
cool.
the good code.
It's sort of like a big genetic orgy, right? They're all just kind of exchanging parts with each other.
Sure.
So
I'll let you say that, Evan.
So what do you think? We find aliens, or aliens come to Earth. Do they have this information scaffold, or do they have a different information scaffold? Do you think is this one so much better than the other ones in what it does?
They'll have one that's probably about as optimized, probably not the same thing. There's one in a million is still a lot of possibilities.
And to be clear, there are genetic codes that it could be formally improved. We're not saying it's optimal. Like you could create, people have created genetic codes that are better at buffering various kinds of errors. So there's, lots of different ways you can make a code that's good. This isn't like singular. It's just crazy that something that in the last 3.5 billion years basically hasn't evolved, has these strong signatures of having been previously very highly tuned by evolution. That's really crazy.
Yes. It's a question that I never even thought about, but as soon as you posed it, I was like, wow, that is really cool.
Yeah.
How do you get an optimized thing that can't optimize itself? It's a
Yeah.
super interesting question. Really nicely put. Got to be S, no?
Well, here's
Ooh.
here's the thing. Here's the thing. It's really
Oh,
cool in terms of what happened in the past, but now we're stuck. Like now you are absolutely stuck and you cannot change it anymore. So, in terms of things that happened in the past, it'd be S. In terms of what's happening now, it would be D. So I think we might have to average it and put it at a B.
putting into B.
Wow. Wow.
Surely push back.
I'm gonna vote. I like your rationale, but I'm gonna vote for Bump. I'm gonna split the difference between you and Evan and say A, because
Okay.
how crazy is it that the genetic code not only allows us to store information in a digital format that's highly robust, but also has this intrinsic error buffering capacity. Like that is freaking cool. A.
I'll go with that.
Yeah,
I'll go
yeah.
with that.
I would definitely, and I'm putting it ahead of the Parasite. I think it's the
Yeah, let's
most.
do that.
Mm.
Do that.
I definitely like that for
Okay.
sure. B would have been, come on, that's
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah.
That would
Okay.
have lit the internet on fire. That
Okay.
would have been. I think that's too. I understand your point that we're a little bit stuck with it, but it's done pretty well. It's done a
Okay.
pretty good. It's done pretty well.
Okay.
All right, next, Octopus, my favorite.
So Tony, this is a late ad. We
Uh-huh.
didn't prep this one
That's
ourselves.
fine.
I mean, it's as if this is for us to riff on.
Yeah.
So
Octopus.
let me maybe pose the
Yeah.
question that I find so interesting about this. So as you know, Octopus had sort of its own evolutionary journey, right? It evolved a separate form of intelligence, very distinct than anything else that exists, other than the sort of cephalopod giant cuttlefish lineage. And it's not a social intelligence, which is interesting. It seems to be a very intrinsic play with the environment and sort of figure out what offerings exist in the environment sort of intelligence. So you see all the jar twisting behavior, all of the maze solving behavior. So there's a lot of intrinsic curiosity with the environment. You get this incredible distributed nervous system. You get its esophagus that goes straight through its brain, makes no
Mhm.
bloody sense whatsoever. But then they just like self destruct after 2 years. And when I
Mhm.
learned this, I was like, no, it's a typo. ChatGPT is hallucinating. No way that this, because I've scuba dived with Octopus, and when you're
Hmm.
with them, you're like, this has the wisdom of ages. It's clearly been patrolling these waters for 30 years. It has
Hmm.
wisdom. It has, there's just a sense there. So it's like, it's such a big disconnect that evolution has set up this sort of big bang strategy, the way they talk about it, that this is somewhat debated, but the male and female will mate. They'll have I think up to 500 eggs. It can be a
Mhm.
very large amount of eggs,
Mhm.
but then there seems to be some like chemical pathways that are initiated within the octopus, and then they kind of just disintegrate and die, and that makes no sense to me whatsoever.
Mhm.
Go
So
rip.
I, I can answer. I can try to answer the latter question, which is look, why do they only live do they live such a short period of time? So this gets to a branch of evolutionary biology called life history evolution. That is like an organism has a life cycle. They have traits and trade-offs all along that life cycle, and the product of that life cycle, right, is some number of offspring with some chance of surviving to their own reproductive age, right? And natural selection is kind of optimizing the number of surviving offspring generation after generation, because anything that increases that number is going to displace those which don't, right? Again, this is getting back to the very beginning of the Darwinian algorithm. But now we have a life cycle in which these changes are taking place. And so there is a strategy that we have, which is called iteroparity. That is iterative reproduction. So we give birth sequentially over the period of our lives, right? This is actually what the Greenland shark does too, right? They can have many hundreds of pups over there, multi centuries of life. That's one basic life history strategy. Another one is called semelparity, which is basically the Big Bang, right? This is very common in plants. A sunflower grows big, makes a bunch of seeds, literally tears its tissue apart to tears its own chlorophyll apart to make proteins for its seeds, right? And that's also can be a very, very good strategy because, and this is what salmon do, right? They go out to the ocean, they swim, mature their whole lives, couple of years, they go back up to the stream that they were born in, and they basically let their bodies fall apart and divert all those resources into making sperm and eggs. That doesn't seem like it should make evolutionary sense, but it often does for the very simple reason that reproduction is geometric. If I make two kids, they make two kids, they make two kids, and they make two kids, right? I have 2 to the 4 kids, right? And so if I'm sitting on a bunch of resources, and those resources are not converting into new factories for making new babies, that's a kind of inefficient use of those resources. If I could make my lifespan quite a bit shorter, but make more copies of myself, but then make, if instead of having 2 kids over 40 years, I had 20 kids in 10 years. Well, even if that came at a cost to my own lifespan, pretty obvious to see where the math of fitness shakes out here, right? After a century, there's going to be a lot more of the guy that had 40 kids in 10 years than the guys that had 2 kids in 40, right? And so octopi, the kind of amazing thing is that they are as smart, have evolved to be as smart as they are, despite having this semiparis life history where I've seen video, like a nature documentary. I'm not an octopus expert, of the giant Pacific octopus and these huge numbers of eggs that they lay, right? And they
Mhm.
will protect those eggs till the day they die, right? Well, they'll basically spend the rest of their life protecting their eggs. But if it's not thousands, I would be surprised, right? So one organism has the capacity to make thousands of offspring. The exponential growth rate potential there is very, very, very high. And if you think about that, what's the lifespan of one individual really matter? That's just one that can perpetuate through time, right? But if you have thousands of offspring in 2 years and they can have thousands of offspring in 2 years, the explosive reproductive potential of that life history strategy, it's hard to beat under conditions that allow it. The reason why the Greenland shark is harder to explain for me than
Mm.
the octopus living 2 years, the Greenland shark living 450 is harder to explain because it's stretching out that reproductive timeline so long that its exponential rate is very, very, very slow. But it sort of makes sense in these resource poor environments. It's living just above freezing, right? Everything is slow for it. Whereas the octopus tends to live in environments that are very resource rich, where metabolism occurs quickly, and where if you can shunt those resources, I'm going to turn fish into octopi, and I'm going to turn that into an exponential rate of 1,000 per 2 years.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That's an unbeatable strategy.
I mean,
I,
you
it
you said
makes
you said it earlier when you were talking about just the Darwinian algorithm. The two ways of persisting are to make more or to not die. And
There you go.
these are throwing everything in the make more basket and very little
There
in
you
the
go.
don't die basket.
Well
I
And
said.
mean,
Well said, Tony.
I think that some of that. Okay, so that sort of makes sense to me for the female. So like the understanding there is okay. The female has this huge. They lays a huge amount of eggs that just takes us so much energy, and they need to invest a lot of that time and energy and resources into. Then I know they kind of puff oxygen
Hmm.
over the eggs, and they make sure they nourish the eggs, and that's just so much energy to take care of all of them. Fair enough. The female dies after 2 years. But what does happen? What about the male? I love your explanation. I think I think it makes a lot of sense. But like, why does the male not go and do and like you know go have another 500 octopus with another female, and then go have another 500 with another female, and then another 500 with another female?
I
Why
mean,
does that
it's
octopus
got the
seem to
same
self
genome.
destruct?
It's the same genes are circulating in the males as they're circulating in the females. If there's something that's uh more helpful to the female than is hurtful to the male, then I mean that can still sweep its way through the population.
And another way of asking this question is, why be monogamous? I know that's not quite the question you're asking, but you have lots of variation across different animals. Whether you have lifelong pair bonding, and the male basically just raises his own offspring, or the male tries to mate with as many females as possible and let the females do the raising, right? And, again, those are two different sort of ways, they kinda map back onto this, like, survival and investing in survival versus investing in just the reproductive side of the Darwinian algorithm. I'm not sure if the male does any parental care in octopi. Maybe you would know, Evan?
I don't think they do, or not
Okay,
more.
they
I
just
don't think,
fertilize and they're gone. So
as far as I know.
they may be pursuing a strategy where they try to mate with as many females as they can, their own lifespan be damned.
So
That's a very common thing among animals. There's a lot of spiders that, like basically they mate with the female and then she eats him. Praying
there's
mantises do the same thing, right? They mate with the
there's
Right.
female and then they try to get out of there before she rips their head off and uses his body to fertilize or to nourish the eggs he just fertilized.
Even that
there's
makes more sense to me than it just nuking itself, and it's unless that dead male is then actually used to feed the babies, which I don't know if it is. I don't know. It's
so
still
there was a thing came out about 2 years ago. Somebody found a massive octopus nesting ground off the coast of
Whoa. Oh
California.
yeah. Oh
It
yeah,
was
yeah,
like
yeah,
a
yeah.
hydrothermal field where there would be like 20,000 octopus nests where the females were laying eggs at any given time.
So cool.
And what they found was there was just a lot more biomass going on in this area because all the octopuses dying were just feeding the local
Mm.
ecosystem, and there was just more food there for the babies.
Hmm.
And
Wow.
See, that makes a little bit more sense. Just make like fascinating though, isn't it? It's just so
yeah,
strange to me.
Yeah, I think we're speculating
yeah,
in the
there's
absence of data, and so it's
yeah.
really hard to give you a satisfying answer.
Now,
I don't think they're.
if I was gonna say something interesting about the octopi, I'd say it's
Mm.
really interesting how they've independently evolved a lot of the interesting, complicated things that you find
Yeah.
in other animal
Right.
groups. I mean, even like their eyes came from a different kind of photoreceptor than our eyes, and things like they use the photoreceptors that we just use to do our circadian clock to make images, and vice versa. There's so many independent
Yes.
inventions along the routes. So
If I
Super
was
cool.
going to say something about octopus, I would say, have you ever wondered what a clam or a mussel would look like if it evolved the intelligence of a dog?
yeah,
That's basically an octopus.
yeah, yeah.
What do you think? I feel like I might have a different opinion here on the octopus.
Mm. Well,
Mm.
is it octopus intelligence or octopus longevity? Because we talked about longevity a lot.
Yeah, well, no, we're definitely not ranking on longevity if the Greenland shark is in sea. It's just sort of craziness of I mean, the ranking criteria has gone awry a little bit, but it is an alien intelligence. It
Yeah.
does seem to do stuff that other organisms don't do. You guys are octopus haters, I can tell it.
No,
No,
I'm
I
thinking
think
A. I'm thinking A. What are you thinking, Tony?
I'm
Oh,
thinking somewhere in that top range, A or B for sure.
Yeah.
okay. I thought you were
Yeah.
going to put it in D.
Oh,
No.
what? Octopus? No, no. D is reserved for the things of nightmares, which are yet to come on the podcast.
Yeah, the things of nightmares. Let's get to those things of nightmares.
All right,
What
cue me up. Cue me up. Let's do tongue.
what tongue-eating parasite? What the hell is that? And why did
All
you
right.
give me nightmares forever by telling me this existed?
Yeah, all right, let's do it. Okay. Can you see it?
Yes.
All right. So there is an isopod. Isopods are a kind of animal that is related to the pill bug that you've played with as kids. They're almost all marine. Pill bugs are really just like the lineage which made it to land. There is an isopod which does, I think, one of the most horrific things that I have ever heard of in my 20 years as a biologist. Cymothoa exigua, the tongue-eating louse. This is a parasite which, when young, swims through the water column, finds the gills of a fish, attaches itself to the gills. If they actually will spend some time there, they'll get larger. They'll be eating the blood and the mucus of the fish, which would be very irritating. Once they get large enough, they crawl inside the mouth of the fish. They use their powerful forelegs to straddle the tongue of the fish. I'm sure the fish is trying to get it out of its mouth, but it's not working. It severs the blood vessels of the tongue so that the tongue rots and falls off, where it then replaces the tongue with its own body. And it uses these extraordinarily powerful, sharp hind claws to hold on to the stump of the tongue. And now, when the fish is eating food, it gets a bite of that food. It is the living tongue that is inside this fish for the rest of the fish's life.
Honestly,
If it's
genius. Honestly, a genius. Honestly. Oh my
if it's
god.
not getting enough food, It'll scratch at the inside of the fish's mouth and make it bleed and eat that. Can
So
can
they
you
got the
imagine?
idea for the xenomorph mouth.
There we go.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Have you ever discovered anything in biology that has like questioned your faith in like God and science? Like, is there anything that's just like, nah, it's too weird? I refuse. You get that from random mutations over time. There has to be a creator. You know, I almost shit's so bizarre and weird. I almost lean there sometimes. I don't
I
quite, but I'm
mean,
like, I understand why it's appealing because that's
th
insane.
I don't know if this is, pointing me to a loving God or a terrifying hating God.
Right.
That being said, this type of isopod lives in a broader family of parasitic isopods, many of which live on the scales or even burrow into the flesh of fish. So it's not that weird that it would have chosen to figure out how to replace the tongue. There's a lot of fish parasitism happening in different kinds within this broader family of isopods.
But it's actually its tongue. And how long can the fish survive? It must be able to survive a long time in this horrible
Yeah,
state.
they can. There's some reports that they're just their body condition is worse. They're not getting as much food, but they can survive a long time in the state. And when they die, the isopod will swim free and try and find a new fish and find a new host.
Talk about freeloading.
Yeah.
That's
Yep.
that's a horror
Oh, and
movie right there.
check this out. There is I just learned this morning while researching this for the show. There's a horror movie called The Bay in which pollution in the bay causes the isopods to move from the water into humans.
Oh, that's actually so disgusting.
So you can really put yourself in the shoes of a fish.
But you make a good point that parasitism, as we've discussed, is not uncommon in the animal kingdom at all. It's just that this very specific example of it occupying the tongue of another fish is just kind of insane and disgusting and icky to think about.
Yeah.
Yeah. We've had actually a lot of examples of parasitism on our list so far. We've had viruses, which are the OG parasite, and some of them are
Mhm.
still kicking after 4 billion years.
Yep.
We had parasitoid wasps, which Tony didn't really go into the visceral details of how that works, but basically, you have a wasp which lays its larvae inside a insect host while paralyzing the insect host, but keeping it alive. The larvae go through and eat the non-vital organs so that the host doesn't rot, and then eventually they rupture forth from the host when mature, which is honestly even worse than the fish tongue parasite. Honestly, worse.
And I believe
Um,
literally the inspiration for the xenomorph.
yeah. So one lesson here is that like the Darwinian algorithm is always finding opportunities in life, and it turns out that living organisms are giant bags of resources, and anything that can use those resources to reproduce themselves can often find a living there. And that we are very lucky to live in the 21st century when we have deworming medication, public health, and we're not suffering from a load of parasites all the time, which is the
Right.
default state of a living thing.
Mhm.
Right. Right. Very well said.
Yeah.
Good point. Okay, where does the fish eating parasite go?
D
Where the
tier,
tongue goes, okay.
100%. Thing of nightmares. Get that shit out of here.
But is it more nightmarish than the thing that could literally eradicate the human race?
Ooh. 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 Oh, that's good.
One's potential, one's real.
Oh, there we go.
Okay. Let's move along to vitamin C deficiency amongst primates.
Yeah. That's me again.
It's a really interesting one.
All right. I'm sure we're all. I'm actually taking vitamin C right now. Doctor's orders.
I haven't checked if I'm deficient in a while. I'm not taking. I'm definitely not supplementing. Let's hope I'm
Yeah,
getting it in my body.
I got like a nerve bruise on an airplane because I fell asleep in a weird position. Welcome to your 40s, Evan. You can look forward to it. And apparently vitamin C, you got to take it. It helps out with the nerves. Vitamin C, you're used to taking it, but it turns out that the default state of mammals and the common ancestor of all mammals, which we came from, have the ability to make their own vitamin C, which, uh, it turns out, and we have almost the entire vitamin C biosynthesis pathway in our genomes. which sailors dying of scurvy in the 1700s would probably be extra pissed off to understand. It's ironic. They got all of the parts except for the last part of it. The last part of it, you basically see that around 60 million years ago, give or take, primates had a mutation to the enzyme L-glucono-G-lactone oxidase, which is one of the last steps in making vitamin C. And as a result, we can't make it. This little thing I'm showing here is just a sort of consensus gene sequence, and you can see that basically these primates share the same mutations in common that are different from the rat. And that's because we being a primate, but also these other primates, we all share a common ancestor, and that common ancestor had these mutations, which mucked up vitamin C biosynthesis. Now, that seems like just our bad luck as a lineage. It seems like it's a shared genetic disease, but it turns out other lineages have lost the ability to make vitamin C too. Guinea pigs cannot make vitamin C. Bats can't make vitamin C. And so when you start to see these parallel losses in function across different lineages, you could say that's just chance, but it's a bit uncommon for important, necessary vitamin metabolic pathways to be lost. Of course, we can get it in our food, so it's not like we die if we lose the ability to make it. But recent work has suggested that, in fact, this might actually be an anti-parasite adaptation. There are parasites. They're worms that cause the disease schistomiasis. I cannot pronounce this word. Schistosomiasis. Tony, help me out. How do you pronounce it?
Schistosomiasis.
Schistosomiasis. There we go.
Just those um,
yeah. We can all say it. It's a tongue twister. And it turns out that these parasites also need vitamin C, which kind of makes sense. It's a fundamental part of metabolism. And if you don't make vitamin C, you starve the parasite of the thing it needs to grow within you. And if you can, and there's a bit of a discordance in rates. The parasites grow very quickly. Animals are turning over quite a bit slower. And so if you're getting some pulses of vitamin C in your diet, that's probably enough for you. Whereas the parasites need it right now. Otherwise, they're not going to grow. And there's this cool paper which tested this with mice, which can make vitamin C. And they basically did a test with mice in which they gave mice that can make vitamin C, and they infected them with these helminths. And you can see that these, whatever the worm is that makes schistosomiasis, you can see that they died over time. And ones which were basically had their vitamin C biosynthesis broken were fine. And so you can actually experimentally test this. Break vitamin C biosynthesis in mice, give them the pathogen, they're okay. Wild type mice are in trouble. So we have what we thought for a long time was a shared genetic disease of broken vitamin C biosynthesis, but it turns out it might in fact be one more anti-parasite adaptation. There's a strong parasite theme here. I didn't quite realize that until now.
Yeah. Very cool. So I'm assuming that for this to have ever been stable, there must have been enough vitamin C in the diets of those organisms to supplement, right, with their vitamin C, because we obviously still require it, and
That's
then
right.
taking it in our diet starves the parasites, not having the endogenous way of making it.
Yeah, you don't have it around all the time. It's a bit boom and bust, and that's harder on parasites than it is on you. We have a different basic biological clock, which is slower than that of the parasites, and so we can tolerate brief pulses, whereas the parasites need a supply when they're growing.
The parasite must have been really bad news, if to trigger.
Must have been.
Yeah.
As I think our viewers are probably appreciating, a lot of evolution is the arms race between parasites and their hosts. It drives a lot of evolution, from the sort of like creation of cells themselves, arguably, all the way up to, organisms like us.
Do you think even that you could say that viruses are one of the most fundamental forces driving evolution and driving adaptation?
Yeah.
Yes, I think for sure.
And even broader, parasites, it's whenever you're evolving against something that's also evolving, you're going to evolve fast.
Yeah.
Right.
That's right. A lot of people think that evolution is like fitting your environment. That's a really common thing I see in my undergraduate students taking intro to evolution with me, is like, oh, like natural selection is acting on whether or not you survived a cold frost or starvation or the predator. Or actually, a predator is a bad example. A lot of people think it's the environment. Environments are relatively stable and predictable compared to biology, which essentially co-evolving, like the part of your environment that's really the hardest to deal with are things that are also co-evolving with you. And as soon as you create, one countermeasure, there's a countermeasure. And it's,
Yes.
if you know the spy versus spy thing, you just have this endless arms race. And you see it with viruses, we're still co-evolving very tightly with them, and we've been doing so for probably 4 billion years, and we'll never stop.
You're right. It's a very good point. I think even me and naturally people do think the environment is the thing you're evolving against, but it's the ecological niche, which is very much all of your neighbors that are
Yeah.
also in that environment. That's a very good point.
Yep.
So where are we putting it? D, I
Mm.
guess. But we don't have any
Ye-
schistosomiasis because of the.
Yeah. Put that shit stosomiasis down in D.
I think so. We'll put it there. Giant viruses to finish off, gents. It's been an adventure.
All right. Giant viruses. Uh, they're ancient gene factories that are as big as bacteria, is what they are. So, these are absolutely huge viruses. Some of them are more than 2 microns long. There's an electron micrograph somewhere where I think somebody found one that was like 3 or 4 microns long once. But they are just enormous, and they have a lot of hosts. You find a lot of them in amoebas. The way that they find them is people grow amoebas and then like take pond water and put it in the amoebas, and something will infect them and they'll make a bunch. When they were first found, they were initially mistaken for bacteria. You do a gram stain on them, they look like bacteria. They are big enough to be seen in an ordinary microscope. But they will infect algae. They'll infect uh, amoebas. Some of them infect animals. We'll get to that. And they are interesting because their genomes are huge. Some of them they have hundreds of genes. Some of them have more than 1,000 genes. And when you look at strains that are related to each other, they're inventing new genes from random sequence at a blistering pace. There's just lots and lots of new genes evolving rapidly at the rapid viral pace. But huge and large numbers of them, and stealing genes from their hosts and altering them and tinkering with them. And so they're just a massive gene factory. And they seem to be connected to the origin of eukaryotes, the origin of things with nuclei. Like there are important eukaryotic genes that are unique to eukaryotes that do important things with our basic structures. You can see they are obviously plucked from within the tree of the giant viruses. There's some gene from a giant virus from within the tree that goes right to the base of eukaryotes. There seems to have been some kind of a massive war back and forth between the giant viruses and the early eukaryotes, where they were trading genes and making things and fending each other off. Like there's even a giant virus that looks like it makes its own second nucleus when it invades a cell. There's all kinds of crazy things like that. So these things are amazing. They do so many things. They infect so many things. They invent so many things. But I gotta dock them a point because they gave us smallpox.
Ah,
Smallpox is smallpox is one of the pox viruses, and the pox viruses are one of the giant viruses. Most giant viruses aren't known to infect animals. The pox viruses do, and they are one of them is one of our worst old enemies.
One of the greatest killers of humans in history.
Yes.
Yeah.
For thousands of years.
Wow.
It's
So
nuts.
so insane.
Yeah, these things are huge. They may be mimicking bacteria in order to get eaten by eukaryotes that eat bacteria. That might be one
and
of
then
the
they infect
origins
them.
of their large size. Yeah, they
Yeah.
trick an amoeba into eating them like a bacteria, and then they infect them.
I have so much greater an appreciation for the power and importance of viruses in this conversation than I think I ever had. I was going to say appreciation, but I'm not thankful for the chicken pox and all the other stuff.
Yeah.
But like thankful for the amount of interesting life that they have undoubtedly created, and the directions of evolution that they've started, and just the way they, they're like tricksters that just take shit from here, shove it in here, see what happens, move stuff around. You just get so much variance because of the action of viruses
Yeah.
and different organisms.
Yeah.
It's so interesting. I think if people can take anything away, it's that. We
Yeah.
owe life to viruses more than anything else.
And generating heritable variants is like the magic
Fuel.
of the Darwinian algorithm. As soon as to be able to generate things that are different and heritable and mix and match things between lineages, that accelerates the rate of evolution and allows us to explore new areas incredibly quickly. And it's just a fundamental part of the generative mechanism of Darwinian evolution.
Very cool. Very, very, very cool. What do we think? Does it go in with C in beside the origin of viruses?
I think so, because once again, so many cool things, but smallpox.
Hey, so Evan, I have one more that I want to add. Last
Please.
one. I want to talk about the origin of complex life as a major transition, or what we would say in evolutionary biology, evolutionary transitions in individuality. What it is to be an individual, what it is to be an organism. We know that life arose a long time ago, at least 3.5 billion years ago, and was necessarily simple. Darwinian chemistry doesn't even have cells yet. And there are these key changes where organisms get together to form a group or a consortium. And that group now begins to evolve as a new kind of organism. It's sort of like Voltron morphing together, and then evolution actually playing out across a population of these groups. And gradually, those groups evolve into functionally integrated organisms. This is a key step in sort of allowing much more complex life to arise, because it's a way of sort of adding hierarchical layers to life, adding new types of parts, and the generative function of having many copies of the original organisms means they can begin to specialize and do different things. So 3 of these, I think, bear sort of calling out, and 2 of them are fundamental for the origin of complex life. The first is the origin of eukaryotic cells. Those are these complex cells which we are built of, right? Which have a nucleus, which have a bunch of compartments within the cell. And this resulted from a symbiosis between a bacterium and a bacterium-like organism that has very deep branching in evolution called an archaean. And in fact, one of the main ideas out there is that the archaea was in fact sort of the major cell host, and the bacterium was a endosymbiont, which gradually became the mitochondrion. So the powerhouse of the cell, it still has its own cell wall, it still has its own genome, it still has its own ribosomes. It's just a compacted, degenerate little derivative of a formerly free-living organism. You can take those eukaryotic cells, push them together into groups, and those can evolve into multicellular organisms. In the absence of multicellular life, this planet would be fundamentally different. It would be a wetter, greener version of Mars. But once you can start building organisms with millions, billions, even trillions of cells working together to create the organismal body, you have the scope for not only radically more complex organisms, like a plant or an animal or a mushroom-forming fungus, but also radically new ecosystems. As soon as you have land plants, tall trees, you create the conditions to evolve all these other ecological niches, right? So the plants that are growing lower on in the canopy, on the ground, the herbivores that are eating all of these things, the parasites of the different types of herbivores, the predators of the herbivores, and even the parasites of those parasites, and of course, viruses across the entire thing. And you can even take multicellular organisms and go one level higher up. You can have what we would call superorganisms, but I really would just call them organisms because they're not any more super than multicellular organisms are. And this would be something like a colony of bees, a colony of termites, where now you have like the bee is essentially an analog to a cell in your body, right? You get a group of them together, right? Most of them become non-reproductive, functionally integrated, work together to facilitate the reproduction of the group as a whole. And so if you sort of think about evolution from the modern day back in time, your body actually contains this Matryoshka doll-like nesting of different levels of individuality. So your multicellular body is one kind of organism, one kind of individual. Each of your cells was once a free living individual, but now they're parts of you. Within those cells our mitochondria, which were once free living bacteria. And the fact that we even are talking about cellular life is also the Darwinization of a collective of previously free replicating, uh, you know, chemistry, which that's how we got error buffering genetic codes. And then you can encapsulate that together into a cell. And so you kind of go from this simple replicator driven and metabolically coupled replicator driven world of pre cells all the way up to the nesting of modern complex life. And these major transitions are the way in which those leaps occur.
That was awesome, man. So well communicated. Incredible. So
Thank
you
you.
think it's far more appropriate to think of humans and most animals as superorganisms rather than multicellular. Like we have bacteria inside of us that we cannot live without. We are a superorganism of cells, bacteria, and lots of other things.
I mean, I kind of wish we didn't use the term superorganism because it's privileging one level when we're not like it's just as appropriate to call a colony of ants a superorganism as it would be to call a single ant a superorganism because it's made of formerly free living cells, which are made of formerly free living cells, which are made of formerly free living replicators, right? Like chemistry. So historically, in like we've called these things which are where a multicellular animal is the building block of the new kind of organism. We've called that a superorganism, like it's one level above the organism.
Right.
But
Right.
I don't know why you would privilege that one level, and if you're not gonna apply the same logic to the origin of multicellular organisms themselves, it's kind of like inferring that a single cell is not an organism. No, it is, right? um, whether I think what you're referring to, we would call the hollow biome, which is that like we live in this like we are not sterile vessels out in nature. We are colonized by trillions of bacteria and archaea, and they play a fundamental role in our biology.
Right.
And are they part of us, or are they living on us? Are we their ecosystem, or are we all part of the same organism? That gets into the sort of the realm of philosophy and how you individuate, how you sort of draw
Right.
these bright lines. And I think that gets more into sort of a opinion than, well, let's put it this way. It gets into the realms of how you draw the lines of definitions. And
Yeah.
definitions cannot be right or wrong. They can only be more or less useful. Definitions are, by definition,
Yeah.
arbitrarily defined by us.
Yes.
Semi-arbitrarily defined by us, but they're not facts of the matter. They're not something which you can argue this is correct and this is incorrect. It's a definition. We're imposing it. And
Yes.
so
Yes.
I think that's a longer discussion about our holobiomes part of the organism or not. And I think there's not a yes or no answer. I think for many of these things, no, we're just transient part of the ecosystem. For some of them, possibly.
I love it. I love it. Well, I think you're an incredible communicator, Tony. You as well. Both of you
Thank you, man.
know your
Thank you.
stuff so well. This has been enormously fun. Where are we going to place as our final one that I'll edit in at the end because I forgot to put the image in here? The transitionary state change, what you want to call it? Where does it go here?
So to me, this is what I do my research on. Like my entire professional career is understanding how increasingly complex multicellular organisms evolve from initially dumb clumps of cells. I think this is the most fascinating transition in all of evolutionary biology. And it's one of these things which it creates complex life as we know it. And so for me, this is S all the way.
Whoa. Yeah, no disagreements.
I'm gonna have to put it there too. We're a little biased on the matter, but
Yes.
Yes.
I understand that, but do you think it's more of whatever this ranking criteria is than language?
Ooh. So
I would
I
argue
would
yes.
say it comes after the Darwinian algorithm because that is the process through which everything unfolds within. But I would say that language is secondary to evolutionary transitions because it's only possible once you've gone through a number of these transitions. You've got to get all the way up
Yeah.
to the point of being a multicellular animal, not only not only origin of cells and and arguably eukaryotes and multicellularity, but you've got to be a special kind of multicellularity with brains and like communication potential, uh, and arguably neurons to make that possible. And so you've got to build a lot of layers first, and that's
Yes.
arguably why language isn't that common, right? Is that there's a lot of prereqs, and those prereqs are the major transitions that we just talked about.
Yes. Absolutely zero arguments here. I think you got to give respect to the rest of biology, and the language is exclusive for us. So I think that nods it ahead. I love it. Guys, any final remarks on this absolutely impeccable, perfect tier list that is unquestionably correct and objective in every way?
Absolutely objective.
Yeah, and definitely very very richly defined and very clear for everyone.
I would say I would love to see maybe a link where you provide the tiles and we can have our viewers create their own versions of the tiers list
That's a
and
great
and
idea.
argue it in the comments. And
Yeah,
I want to see how other people stack them because it's pretty hard to do, right? And it's really boils down to the eye of the beholder, right?
I love that idea. I'll definitely do that. You can create the templates, so I'll
Cool.
definitely do that, and I'll link it below. Guys, this
Awesome.
has been an enormous amount of fun. As I said, you are so richly knowledgeable about biology and life, and it's just insane to me. It's been an honor to have this conversation, honestly, with just how much I've learned. It's been so much fun. Thank you so much for joining me. It really has been a pleasure.
Thank you for having us
Thank
on.
thank you.